This is Tim O'Brien on November 15th, 2025. And today we're going to read the news. We picked three interesting stories in technology news. So the first is a security story. It's a bit of a mystery. If you've ever used a website that links to other websites, you've often encountered Archive.today. It might show up on your browser as Archive.ph. But if you're ever linking to something that's behind a paywall, this archive site is a way that other sites get around that. So again, if you're on Reddit or Hacker News or a site like the Drudge Report or Huffington Post, quite often what you'll see is a link to a paywalled news story, and it's on archive.ph. Now, it's been reported that this site is also under investigation for hosting inappropriate content, but the news story here is there's another group called AdGuard DNS.io. They're a company that does DNS. They received a rather threatening email from a group. They did some investigation into the identity of the group. And it's just an interesting story that raises questions of censorship and law and who are these groups that are pressuring DNS providers to remove access to this archive site. Now, I won't make a comment as to whether or not it's right or wrong to do that. I think it depends on laws in different jurisdictions. But if you read this story from AdGuard, the identity of the group sending them these emails is questionable. It's an interesting story. Got a lot of votes on Hacker News. Read the AdGuard investigation. It's one of those stories that you read and it raises questions about what is the internet? How is it regulated? By what jurisdictions' legal frameworks is it regulated? And what are the different interests at play when a site is doing something that might be unethical? And in this case, we're talking about bypassing paywalls. There are other questions about this archive site potentially hosting harmful content. But anyway, interesting story. See the link in the show notes. In our programming language story of the day, we've got a story from Corey Quinn, the always entertaining Corey Quinn of Last Week in AWS. Amazon is deprecating 24 services, most of which you've never heard of. That's the title that he assigned to his blog post. And he's identifying that they're really starting to deprecate some services that no one uses. And these services are Amazon Glacier, S3 Object Lambda, Snowball Edge, and CodeCatalyst. So just for example, Glacier, he says, and he writes this, Glacier is a red herring. Once upon a time, Glacier was its own service with its own APIs. Now it's an S3 storage class. What they're doing is removing the ability to interact with Glacier via its own API. The other is S3 Object Lambdas, CodeCatalyst. Not even sure what CodeCatalyst is, but then there's Snowball Edge. He writes, this is a weird one because a bunch of customers have run local EC2 instances on them, as well as using them for data transport jobs. So these were customers that were running these edge servers as EC2 instances. So anyway, Corey Quinn, always an entertaining read. You can read it on his website. His website is lastweekinaws.com. And today's Weird Bucket story is AI world clocks. And this is from Brian Moore, Lane Winfield, independent developer. Now, if you look at this site, it's clocks.brianmoore.com. That's BRIANMOORE.com. And what he has are a series of world clocks that are created by different models. I was about to say coding models, but not all models are really optimized for code. And it is very clear when you look at his website. And what he's found is there are some really weird world clocks. And you have to really go to this site to understand what I'm talking about. But he asked 9 different AI models to perform what should have been a very simple task, draw an analog clock showing the current time using HTML and CSS. And what happened was that it really revealed something profound about how artificial intelligence fails at really simple tasks. The website AI World Clocks displays these attempts in real time. You can see what the time is according to the different models' attempts. And they range from functional to completely unhinged. So GPT-3.5 gets the basic structure right. 12 numbers are arranged in a circle with hands pointing to the time. But then there's Haiku 3.5, which consistently forgets what the numbers 2, 9, 10, and 11 are. So it creates clocks that would drive you crazy. These failures get a little bit weirder. GPT-5, which is supposedly the smartest model, adds helpful labels like clock at 12:54, as if we couldn't figure that out for ourselves. DeepSeek 3.1 swings wildly between perfection and chaos. Sometimes it shows a pristine clock face, and other times it arranges the numbers in patterns that defy both mathematics, and common sense. But the crown for surrealism goes to Quinn 2.5, and you should see it. Go to this website. It often produces no visible clock at all, just abstract numbers, arrangements of numbers floating in a digital space. And what's interesting is that clock drawing is one of the medical tests for dementia. Doctors often ask patients to draw a clock showing a specific time, and as cognitive decline reveals itself through missing numbers, it shows up in how people represent clocks. So these AIs are failing in precisely the same ways that human brains fail when they're suffering from dementia. Now, you're going to hear this weird bucket story and think that I'm commenting that these models are not able to create clocks. I will say from my own experience as a programmer, if you're going to have a model create a clock, you're going to give it a requirement as to what that clock should look like. You're not just going to ask it an open-ended question like, create a clock and just draw it however you want. But that's what Brian Moore did. It's very interesting to see how these things fail, sometimes in subtle, but sometimes in hauntingly awful ways. It also reminds me of some of the videos I've been seeing recently on Instagram, where a director tries to direct actors in AI. And, often you'll have an actor say something, but then a voice will happen when they're not speaking, or an actor will try to express an emotion, but instead of expressing an emotion, their face will completely transform into another person. It is interesting that we are still in that space where it is really easy to tell when you're using AI, because it's getting some very basic things incorrect. So for more about those AI world clocks, go to brianmoore.com. And there's a couple more news stories to report today. Google plans to invest more than $15 billion in Indian data centers focused on AI infrastructure, according to Andhra Pradesh's chief minister. Bloomberg reports the expanded investment, up from an initial $3 billion commitment, comes as India positions itself as a global AI hub and demand for cloud services explodes across the region. It seems like every day in another part of the world, there's another announcement that tens of billions of dollars are going to be spent on AI data centers. Blue Origin has achieved a historic milestone with its first successful return landing of a reusable booster while launching satellites towards Mars. The BBC reports this accomplishment puts Jeff Bezos' company on par with SpaceX in reusability technology and could dramatically reduce costs for future Mars missions. Let's just see if we can survive the solar radiation. Disney and YouTube TV resolved their distribution dispute, restoring ESPN, ABC, and other channels after a brief blackout. According to Bloomberg, the deal highlights how streaming services like YouTube TV have become critical distribution platforms as traditional cable continues its decline. The U.S. International Trade Commission will consider a new import ban on certain Apple Watch models over patent disputes with medical device maker Masimo. Reuters reports this follows Apple's attempt to sidestep an earlier ban through software changes, which Masimo argues are insufficient. And that's the technology news for November 15th, 2025. If you're interested in any of these stories, please see the notes for more links. Now, at this point in the show, on a Saturday, I usually do a reflection on the previous week. And this week we had some interesting shows. We had a show on the hidden cost of productivity. And that is, if you use AI coding tools like Cursor, there's a little bit of an adoption curve that you'll experience. You'll get very productive, extremely productive, and you'll start to trust it more and more and more. But there's a certain point you're going to reach where you overtrust it, and you start to realize this thing can make some really subtle and awful mistakes, not unlike the AI world clock story that I just reported. I talk a little bit about what my own strategies are for handling that and the new approach that I use currently. When I'm using a tool like Cursor, I'm asking it to tell me what its plan is before I even approve it to write code. And I'm chiming in on a really minute detail. Instead of just asking it to code something, I'm asking it to tell me what is its multi-step plan to execute. And I'm verifying what the output's going to be. So I have a whole podcast about that. I also had a podcast on a quantum story, and this was a quantum story from Google on the quantum echoes algorithm. And that's an interesting algorithm. They are claiming that they have shown quantum superiority for a particular algorithm used to characterize the structure of a molecule. Now, there's some debate as to whether or not it proved quantum supremacy, But the podcast episode from 5 days ago really touches upon the fact that anytime a large technology company makes a quantum announcement, traditional tech journalism tends to conflate that announcement with previous announcements. And in this case, Quantum Echoes, which is a significant algorithmic improvement, was conflated with an announcement from last year and 3 years ago about the structure of Google's Willow or Sycamore chips. So listen to that episode for more. Then Tuesday, or Wednesday to be more accurate, we had an episode on the Northern Lights or auroras. We had a G4 severe storm on Tuesday night, and I talk a little bit about what causes that, the power of the sun that's creating a coronal mass ejection, a CME event, and how that interacts with the magnetic field to create auroras. But I also talk about how that could one day pose a potential risk to electricity, to data centers. I am working on a larger episode about that in the future. But if you want more information about that, listen to Wednesday's episode. And then we had some tech news episodes, and I talked a little bit more about specific news stories. One of them was this NPM being under attack. There's an attack that was documented by Brian Fox at Sonatype, and it's called Indonesian Foods, and it's been publishing hundreds of thousands of artifacts to NPM.js, and those artifacts are designed to increase their score for what is essentially a Bitcoin incentive program for open source. If you have more interest in that, just listen to yesterday's episode. In summary, I've gotten some good feedback again. We're working on recording. We're working on pacing. And what you're going to see this week is a new change. I'm going to be shipping a lot of episodes that are just the news. And then if I do have a feature story, I'm going to record that feature story separate. Got some feedback from a colleague of mine that said, you've got like 8 to 10 minutes of news in front of a feature story. And more people are interested in the feature story. And if you put the news in front of it, it's not going to last as long as it could. So for example, if I do a feature story about the impact of a meteor explosion on data centers, that's going to live on its own for some time. Putting the news in front of it might be useful for those of you who want to hear the news, but there's a larger audience that wants to learn about meteors or northern lights. And there's also maybe a practical concern there as well. It's easier for me to record the news very quickly every day. It's not as straightforward to record the news plus a 45-minute feature segment. So you should expect a daily update on the news, and then expect 2 feature segments a week. That's the cadence I'm going to start aiming for, and I'll put more time in those feature segments. They're going to show up in this podcast feed as separate episodes. So that's it for the news for Saturday, November 15th, 2025. I hope you enjoy the remainder of your weekend and have a great day.